Hello and thank you for joining today's webinar. We will begin this webinar at the posted start time. You may submit any questions you have using the questions feature in the GoToMeeting webinar control panel. We will encourage you to have a smartphone or another device available if possible, as this will be an interactive session. Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We are ready to begin. Today's webinar is eligible for one contact hour. Seventh Theta Tau International Honor Society of Nursing is accredited as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the American Nurses Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. The speakers and planning committee members have disclosed no conflict of interest. To receive the contact hours for this session, participants are required to attend the webinar and complete the evaluation form, which will be emailed to all participants, all attendees, approximately 1 week after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available via the Sigma repository within a few business days after recording. Following the presentation, we will have time for question and answer. But if you would like to ask questions during the presentation, you may do so in the GoToWebinar control panel. You should see the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. You can send a message through the questions feature. This is where you can type any questions you'd like to pose to the presenters. Be sure to hit send so that your message makes it to us. We'll be checking in with you during this session. So using a smartphone, another web browser, or another device, please open your web application and go to www.mentee.com and enter the code at the top of the screen. The code you will enter is 701494. Once there, please enter your full name when asked. Please avoid using nicknames or informal names. This will allow you to participate in this session and answer questions throughout the webinar. So let's try a couple. Again, on your smartphone, another web browser, or another device, please open the web application and go to www.mentee.com and enter the code at the top of the screen. The code you will enter is 701494. Once there, enter your full name. This will allow you to participate in the session and answer questions throughout the webinar. So let's begin. Sigma publishes the following. Choose your answer from fictional short stories, scholarly books and journals, or clinical nursing blogs. I have 3 seconds. And time's up. And the correct answer is scholarly journals and books. Very good. Next question. In what country or U.S. state, giving the 2-letter abbreviation, are you viewing this webinar? In what country or U.S. state, using that 2-letter abbreviation, are you viewing this webinar? The more that put in one particular state, the larger those are going to be. So it looks like Florida and California are some of our biggest right now. Thank you very much. Great. Now that you have the hang of it, on behalf of Sigma, we would like to thank our speakers for sharing their expertise with us today. Today, our webinar speakers will be Joe Tye and Dr. Bob Dent. Mr. Tye founded Values Coach in 1996 to help hospitals build a more positive culture of ownership. He is a nationally recognized speaker and co-author of dozens of books, including bestsellers The Florence Prescription and, with co-author Dr. Dent, award-winning Building the Culture of Ownership in Healthcare. Values Coach recently launched the Culture Renewal Project to help hospitals emerge from the current crisis with a more positive and resilient work culture. Dr. Dent is the Vice President of Patient Care and Chief Nursing Officer of 3 hospitals in Decatur, Georgia, including Emory Decatur, Emory Hillendale, and Emory Long-Term Acute Care. As part of the Emory, or all are part of the Emory Healthcare. Prior to joining Emory Healthcare in 2019, he was the Chief Nursing Officer and Chief Operating Officer at Midland Health in Midland, Texas. He maintains academic appointments with Emory University, Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center, and the University of Texas. Dr. Dent is a past president of the American Organization of Nursing Leadership, formerly AONE. And of course, he is the co-author of Sigma's Building a Culture of Ownership in Healthcare. Hello, Dr. Dent. It looks like we only have one of you today.
Yes. You know, that big storm that came across the Midwest yesterday with the high winds and the thunderstorms and everything. Joe caught up in Iowa there, lost power yesterday, and it's been more than 24 hours. I got off the phone with him at about 4 or 5 o'clock this afternoon, and he had checked into a hotel, and they didn't have the power there. So Joe, unfortunately, will not be joining us tonight, but he is going to be with us in spirit. I've had the opportunity to know Joe for more than 8 years now. We became acquainted probably in 2012 whenever I was at Midland Health and at Midland Memorial Hospital, and we were in the midst of building a big tower there, and brought him in for a keynote speech and inspire our team at the time, and we've hit it off from there. We've had the opportunity now to publish 4 books, and this one here, the second edition of Building a Culture of Ownership in Healthcare. But fortunately, there's a silver lining in it all. Today happens to be Joe's and his wife Sally's anniversary, and so for the last several years, or many years, he would tell us over the last or whenever we scheduled this on August the 11th, that unfortunately he would miss another anniversary and would have to make it up somewhere else. And so I did send him a text just before this and said, I'm hoping without electricity, you're having a barbecue under candlelight with your lovely wife, Sally, there. Many of you might recognize Joe as the pickle guy, and I'll talk about the pickle pledge here in a little bit. So that's very good. Whenever we think about this year, Matt, and we've had opportunities over the course of the year in one fashion or another to celebrate this year of the nurse. And 2020 as the year of nurse, 200 years ago, when Florence Nightingale was born. So that was, we're celebrating her 200th anniversary. Who would have thought today that we would be fighting COVID and these other crises that we're in? And so anyway, it's a great time to be a nurse and a great time to be in healthcare. So very good.
Definitely. And thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And we'll definitely keep Joe in our thoughts, and hopefully he's having a better time being out of power right now. So, Dr. Dent, we'll go ahead and get started here. Just wanted to ask the question of, what has been the impact of the current crisis on hospital culture?
So that's it's a good question, and I think for many organizations who have a strong foundation of values, and then landed on that, stood on those values whenever we began this crisis back in March. And when you think about their own core values of the organization, I think some of those organizations have done really well. But there's been other organizations that as I talk to colleagues and friends around the country, where it hasn't been that great. And so I think that's it's been interesting. COVID at Emory, we do have a strong set of values. And one of the things that we keep talking about as we've gone through now 2 peaks here in Georgia, is that we're here to improve lives and provide hope. And then we have what's called our true north, to our patients and our families, to our people, and to our community. And so to be able to stand on that we're going to improve lives and provide hope for those people in that regard, how do we do that? And so that's been, it's been very strong in that regard. And we've seen a lot of very positive things happen as we go through this, but together. But we've also seen some pretty tragic kinds of things happen as well. And you think about what COVID, from what's this global pandemic that's embraced our healthcare and communities around the globe, and the impact that's had, the impact on the economy and what healthcare organizations are having to do with the economy as well. And then you throw in the other crisis around social injustice and how do we embrace social justice and equity in our country and around the world as well. So there's been positive impacts, and I think it's been an opportunity to reflect. Why are we going through some of these things, and how can we continue to get better? And I think having a strong culture of ownership is going to help with that in there. So let's go. It's Matt. It's time, I believe, for the first question here.
I believe you're correct. So again, going to that menti.com, typing in that user code of 701494. First question is, my organization has maintained a healthy and positive workplace environment during this crisis. Do you strongly agree? Are you rather neutral? Do you disagree or strongly disagree?
Hey, Matt, you might want to go to the next slide there, or go to the slide. There you go.
So it looks like we're starting to get a consensus there for you.
Yeah, so the majority, and that's somewhat of a bell curve there, and that we agree that we've been able to maintain somewhat of a healthy and positive workplace environment. You think about all the changes that have gone into play during this COVID pandemic, and how all those changes impact our workforce and our people, ourselves, and everything else in there. So that's a very indicative. I strongly agree that we've maintained very strong, positive, and healthy workplace environments, and focusing on those things. But again, thinking about the values and the culture and the attitude within the organization, that we get to, some of that, whether it's very good or not so good. But again, it's opportunities, right? And so we can celebrate the good, and we can identify those things that we can do better. Let's go to the next question there, Matt.
So how do you define a culture of ownership?
So yeah, the culture of ownership, and we think about building and sustaining a culture of ownership. The three essential elements in that culture of ownership is to, one, remain emotionally positive. When you think about, and that's whether it's myself or the people that I'm working with, but how do we maintain being emotionally positive? And that's where the pickle pledge, that's one of the things, and we mentioned Joe Tye, but he created that pickle pledge, and that is, I will turn every complaint into either a blessing or a constructive suggestion. And by taking the pickle pledge, I am promising myself that I will no longer waste my time and energy on blaming, complaining, and gossiping, nor will I commiserate with those who steal my energy with their blaming, complaining, and gossiping. So that's really important. Another way to look at that, and I look at that often, is, can I be a little more grateful for the things that I do have? As the COVID began in March, and I remember sitting with my friends and colleagues and recognizing that it's about to come. And then within that day or the next day, we had our first patient, and then it just continued to rise from there. And then when the codes began and other kinds of things, and rounding and the visibility, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, I too ended up coming down with COVID. And so I spent some time quarantined and working and getting things done. And fortunately, I had a mild to moderate, and have joined now 4 research studies, and planning to donate plasma and other things to be able to help, so I could help other people there. But fortunately for me, I was able to maintain my positivity and then be able to move on from there. The second thing within that culture of ownership that's really important is to stay self-empowered. And there is the self-empowerment pledge, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. But what are the kinds of things that I can do that I'm self-empowered? One of the mantras that we talk about regularly is that we can proceed until apprehended. And so you think about all the things that were happening with COVID and these other crises. What are the kinds of things that we can just proceed and do, and without being apprehended in that regard? And then the third essential element to that culture of ownership needs. We need our leaders, we need our staff and our colleagues and others to be fully engaged in this work. You think about professional governance, and how do you maintain that, or get the buy-in or the input of our nurses at the front line as we're doing providing COVID or care to our COVID and non-COVID patients during this time, which is really important, because there's a lot of great things, initiatives, innovative kinds of things that came out of that early on that began to be adopted as some of the best practices in caring for our COVID patients, and we've had a lot of success in there. So those are the 3 essential elements in a culture of ownership. Let's go to the next one there, Matt.
What do you mean by the concept of invisible architecture?
So yeah, the invisible architecture, and we think about we think of building a culture of ownership in healthcare, and it's the invisible architecture, and there's really 3 parts to that invisible architecture. You have it's the building metaphor, if you will, but you have the foundation, and we talked a little bit about that earlier, and how you can stand on that foundation, and that's on the values. And the values of the organization, core values, are very important. But how do we connect our personal values to those core values, which is important too? And so that's the foundation that we have to lay when we're building a house. The superstructure, what's built around you, the walls and everything, that's the culture within the organization. So you see the culture that happens, it's what holds the building up. And then the interior design within that building is considered the attitude in there. And so going back to being an emotionally positive, the attitude that's there. In magnet organizations that many of us either have or wanting to aspire to become a magnet organization, when you walk into an organization that is considered magnet, you can feel it. People say it's palpable in that regard. And so whenever you think about this invisible architecture, whenever a patient, their families, our people, or anybody else from the community, our board members and docs and nurses and everybody else walk into that building, what are they sensing and feeling? It's that attitude that you see, the culture within the organization. So those are the three parts of, when you think about it, that invisible architecture. Let's go on to the next one, Matt.
All right. So the next question that we have is, why do you say the healthcare organization should move from accountability to ownership?
And you might need to change the slide. So here, when we think about this one, I want to make sure we understand this. When I'm saying I am going to hold you accountable, what is that? How does that make you feel? That I'm going to have to hold you accountable to this, so for whatever it is that we're doing. That's all right. So we got about 60-40 there. Yeah. One day I was visiting with a group of leaders in a hospital in Texas. It was down in South Texas somewhere. And somebody said, Bob, how do you hold people accountable? I said, well, that's kind of tough. And there was a pharmacy student that was in the back of the room. And I asked her, I said, how does it make you feel when somebody says, I'm going to hold you accountable? And she goes, well, it feels like, I'm being micromanaged, or I might be, there's somebody overseeing everything that I'm doing. And they don't have the empowerment, if you will, to be able to make changes and do those kinds of things. And so when you think about this and what Joe and I talk about in building a culture of ownership in healthcare, it's really moving from accountability to ownership. And there's three levels of that accountability. There's the hierarchical kind of accountability, and that's manager top down. So in 2012 into 2013, whenever I was with Midland Memorial Hospital, we received a non-conformity in our patient experience related to leadership. Nobody wants to receive a non-conformity, whether it's Joint Commission or any other accrediting body, but we received a non-conformity there. And so we began to work, and it was really a top-down driven thing. We didn't get much of a movement. We had everybody attend these different sessions and said, you've got to do these things or we're going to hold you accountable to that. But it wasn't really until we started working on the core values and really talking about the values of the organization, the 12 core action values and other kinds of things, that we were making a difference. And that's the second level of the three levels of accountability, and that's the cultural accountability. In that cultural accountability, recognizing that there may not be a leader on duty 24/7 and overseeing every interaction at the bedside or wherever that interactions may take place. It's really about people and people making those differences there. And then there's the top level, and this is the kind of accountability and getting to that culture of ownership that we really want. That's that personal accountability, that I'm going to take personal accountability for my work. I'm going to take ownership of that. I'm going to be responsible for some of those things. So a couple of examples in that. You think about COVID and what we've heard from leaders in the country to leaders within our healthcare systems. We talk about the 3 W's that can prevent possibly COVID. And so we want to make sure that we're wearing our masks and that we're watching our distance and staying 6 feet apart from each other, and that we're washing our hands. 3 simple things that we can do. And if we did those things, perhaps we slow down, or we don't, and we can get to the vaccine that we need to be able to overcome the COVID. But because there's so much dissension in there, whether it's in the community or whether it's in our own healthcare systems, and so from a hierarchical kind of response or accountability in here, that we go around and we monitor, we audit, and we catch people that might not have their mask on appropriately, or they're not watching their distance in the room. And that's hard, right? Because we know that if you're not doing that, that you could end up having issues. People get sick and they go out. And so you really want them to own it themselves. And so how do you create that personal responsibility to be able to do that? When I was a patient years ago, and this was in Midland, I was in the hospital for a period of time. If you've ever had an NG tube placed in your through your nose and everything, it doesn't feel good. In fact, it's painful, and it doesn't look good either. But I knew I had to get up out of the bed and walk. And so I got up out of the bed. My wife was with me, and we walked out into the hallway. Up the hall came two of their good friends and their managers. And it was right at change of shift. It was about 6 or 7 p.m. in the evening. And they walked up with an iPad, and I thought they were just going to be authentic, which is core action value number 1, and say, hey, Bob, how's it going? But instead, they came up and they went through the questions that we were asking, and we wanted them to round on every patient every day on their shift and ask certain questions in there and record that. So we knew that they were going to do that. That's a part of accountability. Well, for me as a patient, that felt impersonal. There's probably ways to script that better or do better with that kind of thing, but it felt impersonal. I got out of the hospital, and that following week, I came back in and I collected all the iPads, and I said, I want you to be yourself, and I want you to make the patient feel special. And so we did, and we made some improvements there. My CEO and I, around Thanksgiving time, we were out making rounds on a Saturday right before Thanksgiving, passing out cookies and other kinds of things. And we walked up, and Jim Forstner here, he's our CEO, great guy. And so I noticed in his leadership, I've only been with Emory for about 4 or 5 months, he creates great relationships with people and great rapport. And so he has a way of talking to the staff that doesn't make them feel bad, but connects the dots to why we do certain things. And so it's not as much about holding them accountable, which we was, but it was about helping them be responsible for how we were doing within our organization. So that's really important on how we do those kinds of things, and holding either people accountable or taking personal responsibility and ownership. And that's the direction we really want to go. So Matt, let's go to the next question here.
All right. The next question you should see on your slide.
So let me talk about this one here for a second as we go into it. Now, what % of the paid hours do you really think are wasted on toxic emotional negativity? Greater than 20%, 10 to 20, or less than 10? Now, toxic emotional negativity is gossiping, complaining, bullying kinds of behaviors, any of those kinds of things that would happen in an organization that would be considered toxic in that regard. Very good. We get good responses there. And that's about right. It was, and you can continue to answer the question here, but I want to say in here, Cy Wakeman, she wrote the book No Ego, and it's a great book if you ever want to read that one too. But she has done research in the past, and she recently completed some research, and it almost validated what she had done in the past. And she estimates through that research that people generally spend about 2.5 hours, every employee, every day, complaining, blaming, gossiping, bullying, or other kinds of toxic kinds of behaviors. 2.5 hours per employee per day. So if you calculate that out, how much is it really costing an organization to be able to do that? Outside of the financial cost of that, if you were to cost that out on the average salary, total number of employees multiplied by 2.5, one organization we calculated, it could cost up to $15 million a year and blaming, complaining, gossiping, bullying kinds of behaviors from that, because they're taken away from providing excellent patient care or that patient experience or creating that positive workplace environment. But we also recognize through other studies that any person who's been a victim of any sorts of abuse or harassment, those kinds of things, many of them are going to leave. And so you have the cost of the turnover associated with those kinds of things, which are very, very important. It erodes that trust and teamwork in there. We had Don Berwick and Lucian Leet. Whenever they talk about killing 100,000 lives, or you think about the different outcomes, what oppression or toxic kinds of behaviors decrease that teamwork and trust that leads to bad outcomes. And so I had a niece, she graduated from college at Northern Arizona University in Arizona. And so she was getting her first job and going through her interviews. And she called me up and she says, Uncle Bob, I'm going to do these interviews. What should I do? And I said, Desiree, you're a bright person and you just graduated school. You've got your whole career in front of you. So whenever you go in and do these interviews with the leaders there, ask them, tell me about your patient experience. Tell me about your hospital-acquired conditions. Tell me how turnover is, all of those kinds of things. If it's not doing great in those areas, then you might assume that there's toxic kinds of behaviors there. And as a new grad nurse, do you really want to go and work in that sort of place? And so we got to really watch for those kinds of things. And we've got to address it real time, every time. We think about that if they're not going to take personal accountability and responsibility for their own attitudes, behaviors, and other kinds of things, and engage in those kinds of toxic behaviors, then they do have to be held accountable. And we clearly outline that in our new book. Let's go to the next question here, Matt.
All right. Our next question for everyone is, how would you describe your own stress level during these crises? It's not a problem. I have my days, but overall pretty good. Or many days, I'm just very overwhelmed. All right, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. And I understand, those days. It seems like, some days it's really overwhelming, and other days it's going pretty good. Right now, through these crises and what we're going through, some days it seems like there are more days that we're feeling somewhat overwhelmed with all the changes and those kinds of things. It's been pretty remarkable. Just yesterday, was with a group of nurse leaders, and we did an online poll too, similar to this, but it was using adjectives in there. And they said, how would you describe, and with 6 or 7 adjectives, what 2 words would come up in there? And in the overwhelming majority of the people who responded in there identified exhausted. That's I can understand that, but proud. As we think about where we've come and what we're doing, that we feel very exhausted in this work. And as nurse leaders and nurses and understanding that exhaustion and then being proud, having your days there, but overall doing pretty good is good. One of the things as we go about our work, and I have a good friend in Louisiana. He posted in Facebook not too long ago, Gerald Bryant, CNO there. He was a chief nurse and within the Baylor healthcare system, and out of Waco at the time, or Temple. He was in Temple. But he's now back in Louisiana, which is home for him. Great guy. But he posted something, and I was on furlough, which is another unintended consequence of COVID. So I spent a week and turned that into something positive too. But one of the things I did was I caught up with some of my colleagues from around the country to check in on them, because we really hadn't had that much time to do that. But he posted, as he went out and made rounds, he had to be, and you have to be on top of your game. You've got to, be there. You've got to provide what is really core action value number 10, which is enthusiasm. And the second cornerstone of that is energy. And so I have to show up every day with enthusiasm and energy. And when you make your rounds and you see what's happening within your units, the exhaustion that people are feeling, and how can you help them feel special and thank them for being present. When COVID hit back in March in our organization, we pretty much, and like everybody else, I know, we stopped all the routine meetings. And so we stopped all of those things and said, we're going through some significant change here. And so this is, in a leadership sense, a change management project, and it's huge. And in order to be able to understand what happens, what is a natural change management project, we know people are going to be afraid. They might be angry. There's going to be some apathy and those kinds of things. And in that curve, you get into this valley of despair. In this valley of despair, it's oftentimes mentioned that how deep you go into this valley of despair and how long you stay in that valley of despair is going to be around your leadership, visibility, and communication. And as I rounded, I sensed that and understood what was happening with our team. I could see the fear in their eyes, and as well as the other leaders that were rounding. We could sense that. And so we had to increase that. But as we did those things, one, we improved what was happening at the bedside. But then you'd go back to your office and it was like, man, that just wore me out. And you come home and you drop. We were everybody, and you included, spending 12, 14, 16 hours a day just making rounds on all hours of the shift every day of the week for weeks at a time. And it wasn't, it's clearly not sustainable and healthy. And we get to then addressing our own resilience in there. But that's very important to be able to understand and recognize what is natural kinds of stress, that you're not holding people accountable, if you will, to being emotionally positive in that time and saying, let's talk about what you're sensing or what you're feeling, that fear that I see in your eyes or the concern that you have and those kinds of things, and get to a level of understanding with the people and get to a much better place there. So that's really important. When you think about going back to even our own personal resilience, and I think teams across the country recognize how important our own resilience is to maintain our own health, mental, mind, body, and spirit. But within the book, and we talk about this, and it's the self-empowerment pledge. And there are bracelets little bracelets that go every day. Today's Tuesday, and it's about accountability, but it's about, I will not allow low self-esteem, the self-limiting the beliefs, or the negativity of others to prevent me from achieving my authentic goals and becoming the person I am meant to be. So it's about me taking my responsibility. Two that I really like. One is Monday's promise about responsibility. And that is, I will take complete responsibility for my health, my happiness, my success, and my life. And I will not blame any others for my problems or predicaments. As we think about those two promises, that responsibility and accountability, I've seen lives change on those things. And then oftentimes I love Friday's promise, and Friday's promise is about resilience. We've been talking about that, and that is red for resilience in there. And resilience is about taking failure and things to be able to say that I'm going to make this a platform for future acceptance and success. And so you think about that failure, and you might think about healthcare in general. You might think about your organization if we go back to some of the other questions that we have. But if we recognize that, yes, we might not have created a culture that recognizes social justice and equity. We haven't created a culture that allows for leaders to be present and visible. Whatever systems kinds of things that we have within our organizations, and recognize that as failure, and then be aware of those things and make that and be courageous and persevere to make this opportunity as a self-reflection to make it a platform for future acceptance and success. So that's more on the self-empowerment pledge. It's in the book as well. So let's go to the last question here, Matt.
So the last question we have here is, Dr. Dent, what advice would you give healthcare leaders in today's world?
Yeah. It's a good question. We're here talking about building a culture of ownership in healthcare, and it's the invisible architecture of values and attitude and self-empowerment in this regard. What we've been through over the last several months, if you've kind of glanced at what could be coming, and I say could be, the modeling is always different, but we could be headed into something that may be even worse than where we are right now. So in that regard, we do as leaders need to be prepared. We need to create this environment, a positive and healthy workplace environment, the relationships that we have with our teams, and they're helping to maintain that sense of being emotionally positive and self-empowered and fully engaged in our work. And then I'll finish with some of just a couple of things I mentioned on the 12 core action values, personal values that connect to the values of the organization. And values of the organization that you have, they're not just on the wall, but we live those things. And how do we live that? Core action value 1, and that's going back to being authentic. I think people need to see us as authentic leaders, that we're caring and compassionate, and we have the best interests of our people, our patients' families, our community at heart. And so that's core action value 1, and understanding, who am I? What kind of a leader am I? And am I embracing that sort of leadership? And leadership, I'm the past president of the American Organization for Nursing Leadership now. We changed the name from AONE, the American Organization of Nurse Executives, and we created a driving force that says every nurse is a leader. So it's not a formal title, and we recognize nurses as professional nurses. And so when I talk about leaders and nurse leaders, it's about all nurses in that regard. The second core action value, which I think is really important, and that is core action value number 9, and that is about focus. What are we focused on? If you're trying to do all of these things, you're not going to do very well. So how do you get to that level of focus within our organizations, our annual operating plans, our unit-based plans, and other kinds of things, and make sure that we're focused on the right things. We're asking the right questions in there. I've talked about core action value number 10, and that's enthusiasm with a second cornerstone. Each of the core action values, there's 12 of them. Each of them have 4 cornerstones, and core action value number 10 is about that enthusiasm, and the second cornerstone of that is energy, and that's got to be very important. So those are the 3 that I would say is really important in that regard. And the next thing is that we really got to take care of ourselves. We're in it for the long haul. We don't know what to anticipate over the next several months. So we've got to be resilient in that regard and make sure that we're taking care of ourselves so we can better take care of our families, our people. And then if we do that and recognize that those are our principle in what we're trying to do, people first, safety always. In that regard, as you develop the relationships with our people and make rounds and be visible, transparent communication, include them in decisions that affect their work at the bedside, we're going to be able to make it through it. It's going to be tough, but we're going to be able to make it through it. So I'm open to any other questions that you might have as we go through this.
All right. Well, thank you to our Sigma author, Dr. Dent, for spending some time with us today. We'll now begin our question and answer session. Please type any questions you have for the authors in the Menti.com website or on the questions feature in the GoToWebinar control panel. One question we have from Crystal Bennett is, where can we order those bracelets?
You can order those bracelets at Values Coach. Joe Tye has those bracelets on his website. Just go to Values Coach Inc. and he has those bracelets there for you.
Another question from Janice Leto is, how would you move ahead with goals on the strategic plan during this time for COVID, or this time of COVID?
It's a great question, and that's going back to that core action value number 9. And I had that conversation today with my CNO council, it's the special directors throughout the 3 hospitals that I have, as we're starting to plan really for our next fiscal year. And the question that we had is, recognizing, yeah, we've got all these things that we need to work on, possibly in the background, but what are the 2 or 3 things that we really need to focus on if we're going to improve? Everybody's going to have a different question or answer to those things, but I think it's a good question to be able to ask. What are the top 2 or 3 things? If you can create leader standard work or standard work around those processes and see gains, perhaps you can go to something else. But clearly, when we're thinking about people first, safety always kinds of things, there are certain things that we just can't take off our radar. So we got to make sure that we're keeping track of those things, the patient safety, quality, patient experience, and those. But in my particular department, if I was a unit director or manager in a particular area, what do I really need to focus on right now that's going to help my team advance with all of this? I've always thought that regardless of everything that's on an annual operating plan or an action plan there, if I'm really developing that rapport with our people in there, professional governance in that regard, and people are empowered or make the decisions, Crises and Posner, they wrote the book, The Leadership Challenge. And in there, number 1 is that we model the way or be the example. And 2, that we inspire a shared vision. So if we can create that shared vision about where we want to go, whether that's at the department level, hospital, or system, then you get out of the way. Let professional governance be able to take on those things. Guide them, keep them focused, core action value number 9, and maintain that energy and enthusiasm. Good question.
Our next question should be on your screen. How did you engage nurses in collaborative decision making?
That's a very good question. And you think about from a professional governance, I think the most powerful part of the professional governance is that unit-based practice council. That's where the decisions are being made closest to the bedside. You're engaging the staff in there. You're asking certain questions. You're mentoring and coaching and doing that work. But it doesn't have to be in a face-to-face meeting. So it doesn't, in today's world, it's hard you shouldn't have more than 10 people in a room at a given time anyway, right? And you got to be socially distanced. And so we're seeing more people right now engaged in our unit-based practice work through Zoom. We've had more people involved in there. We've seen more people even involved in staff meetings and using technology than we did when we created the space and had cookies there, for example. But we've had more people there. But outside of that and in pulling people together, the strongest, and I think, and it's still related to professional governance, is that you're getting that one nurse's input. So I walk up and say, hey, this is what we're thinking about doing from an admin team. What do you think about that? Hey, we're at a system level, we're having this conversation, but I want to get your input about that. And so you go around and you're asking, as part of your leadership rounds, using lean kind of technology that could be going into the Gemba. And so I go into the Gemba with other leaders and we talk to staff and say, tell me about this process. And so we learn a little bit. It doesn't have to be long, 10, 15 minutes, because we know our nurses are busy. But we do get their input, insight, and we walk away, and then the leaders and I would sit down or stand there, and we say, what did we learn from that interaction, and what kinds of things can we change? But it can be just that one nurse, but using technology is another way. So we've got to really expand our mind about what professional governance is, and it's really about getting input from the people doing the work at the front lines in that work, and then strengthening those kinds of relationships. Good question.
Can I take these same principles and incorporate them in the ambulatory setting?
Absolutely. There's all of these. You think about, and we've got a great ambulatory clinics. We've got over 200 clinics within Emory Healthcare, strong nurse leader there and other leaders within that department. But again, and they're going to be one of the first, I believe, to be able to apply as an ambulatory setting for Magnet. And Magnet has all the things that you have to do to create a Magnet organization. And oftentimes you think about that primarily in hospital settings, but it can happen in ambulatory settings. And again, that's about being visible. Now, it's hard to make rounds on 200 clinics, but you can figure out ways to be able to engage our teams using technology listening to concerns, being present, really. I know our ambulatory leader with an Emory, she's available. The staff feel comfortable texting, calling, emailing, any of those kinds of things. And as leaders, we've got to create that sort of an environment where people are comfortable coming to you, and that it doesn't matter if they jump 4 levels or whatever the case may be to come to you. You're still going to be able to hear and understand what's happening, and we're going to be able to address those things. So yes, you can to do those things when you're emotionally positive, self-empowered, making the decisions at the bedside or in the clinic, and then being fully engaged. At an ambulatory site, which is large, trying to look at that from an ambulatory perspective, or within their clinics themselves, being fully engaged. What can they do to improve the patient's experience, or the provider or the staff that's working there? What can we do with those kinds of things? And then ask those questions, and empower people to make those kinds of changes. So yeah, all of these principles that we've talked about in building, and then also sustaining this culture of ownership within the healthcare is applicable across all healthcare settings and even outside of healthcare.
We have another question that comes to us here. Social distancing measures at our hospital has made it difficult for leaders and staff to connect. What can be done to keep the team encouraged and engaged?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, everybody's got to be at least 6 feet apart. You can't have more than 2 people in a break room, 3 if you've got a big break room. We can't sit down, with my CNO council. I want to maintain that sort of relationship with them and do what's right. But again, using Zoom technology, we do have part of our ground rules with our leadership team that we're going to be engaged on Zoom, and you're going to use video so I can see you, smile, I can see your eyes. Maybe, and that's the way you can see people smiling is through Zoom, because if we're in our room, we've got to have our mask on, right? And so we talk about that being smiles. You can see the smile in the eyes in there. But again, rounding and being visible in the department, having conversations at we do tier huddle system, or tier huddles, in which we do it at the unit level, and then at the department level, and then so forth. But engaging people in those kinds of things. We've had we round still on our weekends with our admin team, our leadership team, nursing leaders. They'll round too, and make sure that people have the supplies and equipment and everything that they need to do. But again, it's about being visible and making those connections, being resilient, having a little fun, a little levity through some of these things are important because we're working under some stressful conditions. And that's just because of COVID. I mean, if you think about it, we've been providing healthcare since Florence Nightingale 200 years ago, going back to her, and she was dealing with quite a bit within the Crimean War and all of those things. And so we are at an opportunity here to rethink about how we're delivering some of our care, engaging with our patients and their families and others. But in this regard, how do we maintain that connection with our staff? So that's a good question.
Have you found that your leadership style has changed during COVID-19? What is your leadership style, and what styles have you used during this stressful time?
Yeah, I think, I think I've had to enhance perhaps, some of my leadership style. When I started at Emory, or even in my past organizations, I've been a nurse and nurse leader for more than 30 years. But developing relationships with people has been very important to me. And you think about that change that we talked about here. So pulling down some of those meetings, we were spending a lot of time, myself and other leaders, spending a lot of time visiting with staff where they were, making sure that we maintained some of the things that we really wanted to do, felt their pain and that fear in that regard, and then advocated on their behalf within our operating unit or hospitals or within the system, and be able to recognize those things too. My leadership style hasn't changed too terribly much in there. It's really about engaging people. The principles that we have within this book, and then other strong leadership principles that I like to make sure that I espouse, I've maintained that. For example, one of the things that I've tried to do is not hold meetings on Fridays. And so I'm not going to schedule a meeting on Friday unless it's absolutely important or urgent in that regard. But I do take time to make sure that I've answered all my emails, fulfilled all my responsibilities for the week, the calls and everything. And then I've planned my week ahead and making sure that, the things that I'm doing next week, that I have time. And in my particular case, being a chief nurse within 3 hospitals, that I'm going to spend some time in each of those hospitals and make sure that I'm making rounds and developing rapport with staff there, that they feel comfortable coming and visiting with me if there's any issues that we can address real time every time. Good question.
Our next question should be on your screen. How important is peer recognition to reinforce the values we need to promote for a healthy, positive culture?
That's another, lots of great questions here. Think about that cultural accountability, or that peer accountability, or even recognition, and reinforcing the values that we need to have. And so if you think about it from that pickle pledge we were talking about, that we're not going to engage in any sorts of toxic behaviors, and we're not going to commiserate with any of those things, and recognizing that if we're going to do that, then it's going to create an unhealthy environment, and we're going to have worse or not so good outcomes. So that peer accountability, or even the peer recognition, in there with the face masks and those kinds of things, we've got to create that sort of an environment that people, and it's a systems related thing. What kind of system have we set up that allows for that sort of peer recognition? That, hey, I can say, hey, you're not wearing your mask right. We're sitting close together. What can we do in there? And then to be able to understand that people are stressed. I had a colleague took a tour with leaders from around the country to Peru just a couple years ago, 2018, when I was as president of AONL. She was a good friend, colleague out of Florida. And so she mentioned that she noticed that one of her peers were sitting in front of her, and she was crying from time to time, and knew that she, at the moment wasn't good enough, didn't feel comfortable enough to say anything. And so she would ask her whenever she got into this emotional state, said, hey, can we go on a walk? And so they did. They started walking around the hospital, and it took several days or so, and then this nurse opened up and began talking about what was bothering her with her family and the relationships that were happening there, and she was able to feel that, and it's empathy, it's compassion. So how do we recognize and reinforce those values within our organizations? I think one, you go back to when you think about standing on values of the organization. How do we, and whatever your values might be, and in this case, improving lives and providing hope for our patients and families and people in our community. So how do we stand on those values? And then for leaders and the peers to be able to recognize that we've got to have this culture, the superstructure of this metaphor with the building, and then the attitudes within the department. As leaders, if we're not addressing some of those toxic behaviors real time every time, then we're allowing that to continue to happen. And you're going to have poor outcomes, including an unhealthy kind of a culture, or an unhealthy or a bad outcomes in there. So that's a good question. I think we've got to make sure that we're standing on those grounds. And the only way you can be able to do that is be visible in your communication to develop that rapport, and then help people, hold people either accountable, or that you at least taken on a cultural accountability, and hoping people will take more personal responsibility in that as well. Good question.
Right. We have time for about one more. I think this is a good one to end with. What is your advice to young nurse leaders? I am 26, and have been in nursing leadership positions for over 3 years, and I feel intimidated at times because there's so many awesome seasoned nurse leaders.
That's a good question, and congratulations on that. 3 years in there, as you started out at 23. You've got a long career ahead of you, and so enjoy the journey, enjoy the ride that you have. You're going to have some up times and bad, perhaps some bad times in there too. So some advice that I would have is identify a mentor that you can call on. Now, I have several mentors across the country, and so when I get into a position where I'm not where acting or behaving or whatever the case may be the best that I can be, I can text them or call them and say, hey, here's what the challenge that I'm going through, either personally, professionally, or whatever the case may be. And so you might have different mentors for different things. And then I have people that'll call me on a regular basis, and so it's that networking in there. I'd also encourage you to make sure that you've joined a professional organization, Sigma, the American Nurses Association, the American Organization for Nursing Leadership, any of them. Whatever your specialty is, that you've joined that professional association. And similarly, as we talked about being highly engaged at the unit level, that you're highly engaged in your professional associations as well. Some people say, well, can I run for a national office? And I always tell people, well, get involved in your state office or even your local area. Get involved there, make some differences, understand it, and then move into some of the others. But don't rush through some of those things. Those would be some of the advice that I have. There, you've got my contact information. You can always reach out, ask me other questions around that. I enjoy working with nurse leaders and helping through that as well. But you can always contact me. I am connected via social media on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and so you can connect with me there as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our presenter today for all of this great information. Sigma is grateful that you took some time to share this information with the audience, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Very good.
If you'd like more information about this book, the one discussed today, please visit our website at www.sigmamarketplace.org. As a reminder to our attendees, please be sure to check out Sigma's upcoming webinars, podcasts, and resources to support you and your colleagues at www.sigmanursing.org. Previously recorded webinars and podcasts are freely available on the Sigma repository. We hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.